Welcome to Players Only, your backstage pass behind the scenes of today's PC and video game industry. I'm Scott Steinberg, and today, co-host Haley Bright and I are taking a closer peek at the business's most accomplished game designers. Our first stop, a look at how the field's legends always stay one step ahead of the game.
You'll often find that these people have a voracious appetite for entertainment, for media, for reading. They're interested in almost any topic you can imagine.
Some of the designers that have had really breakthrough games are coming from some other space, whether it's, I don't know, theater or architecture or just visual arts in general or Hollywood, and they kind of come to this and they have an understanding and an appreciation for games and game design, but they're also sort of not tainted or solely in that space. Someone like Will Wright, who, he wasn't an architect or anything, but he's so curious that sure, he's a game designer at heart, but he does so much research, so much reading, has so many interests sort of beyond games, and he kind of collects up all that interesting stuff and funnels it into game design.
There's something about sort of that toy quality. Most game designers who have been successful, they really do think about the player, somebody who you want to have play with this, and how are they going to engage with it.
Making games is one of those activities which is consistently creative, where you're always being challenged to try something new and try to challenge yourself and your team to come up with ideas that just didn't seem possible 3 weeks ago.
There's two parts of exceptional game design, and one is the creativity, of course. It's coming up with great ideas, winnowing out the ones that aren't so good, but I think it's maturity. I've really been lucky to be with Cliff Bleszinski as he's matured as a game designer, where he understands that at some time he's got to let some things go if he's going to get that game shipped.
The secret ingredient that I always think of is humility. That in order to be a good game designer, you have to have a certain amount of humbleness, because to be a game designer is to be raw. Great games do not just spring forth from someone's head. They become great because they spent the time watching other people play it.
Speaking about learning a thing or two from others, what about your favorite game designers? Whose work did they most admire?
Sid Meier, he's my hero. He certainly inspired me to become a game developer in the first place. So did Will Wright. I was a big fan of SimCity. I still like Peter Molyneux's games. I mean, I don't play them as much, but I certainly enjoyed Power Monger, which in many ways was the first RTS that people forget about. And of course, Chris Taylor, who created Total Annihilation. There's a bronze statue at Stardock, of him looking off into the sky with a box of Total Annihilation in his hand.
Miyamoto is #1 on my list. He's awesome. Definitely admire people working in the MMO field. Rob Pardo did an amazing job with World of Warcraft, and that game is, pretty much my favorite game of all time. It's awesome.
I always go back, honestly, to the work of Danny Barry, who did Mule and Seven Cities of Gold back in the 80s. Those were really formative games for me and first sparked my interest in multiplayer.
One is Sid Meier and the second would be Hideo Kojima. For both Civilization series that allowed me to make games and skip school in the past. Skip even family events for that matter. And Hideo Kojima, which when I played a game of Hideo Kojima, Metal Gear Solid especially, I started and ended it in one go through.
A game designer who really moves me is Jason Rohr. He did Passage, and most recently he was in the Independent Game Festival for Between. His works are really engaging to me and interesting. They're very small experiences, and yet they leave me thinking for days.
I'm really curious to see what Warren Spector's working on. He's working with Disney, which is, for me, an unintuitive connection. So I'm very curious to see where he's going with it.
To me, the most impressive game people are the people who make games on a limited time frame and a limited budget. If Miyamoto wants to have another 2 years to work on, the next Mario game, he gets whatever the hell he wants. Who you're gonna tell Miyamoto no? The people that I look up to are the people who are doing it without all the sort of, they don't get inducted into the Gaming Hall of Fame because, they make smaller games or games that don't necessarily, rate as, 9s and 10s, but they're making, games that are 7s and 8s, and that they're really compelling, and they do it on a time frame and a budget, which is infinitely harder to do.
We decided to get down to work too and connected with the best of the best to find out the secret to their success.
We've always taken a very collaborative approach to design. We ask everybody in the company to put out ideas when we're coming up with new IP, and when we do have an IP that we begin working on, We have large groups of people brainstorming on various aspects of the design so that we can make sure that all the great ideas are put out there, argued about, and eventually the best ones filter.
You looked at any of my titles, from A to B, it was always about making things bigger. And now it's actually about making it more fun. It's about making the experience easier to get into, or persistent, or more fun in a shorter period of time.
I've found you've got two ways of going. Either you sit down and wait for divine inspiration. Sometimes that you'll be just in a certain situation and a flash will come to you, and that's great. If you get those all day long, that's fantastic. The other way that it works is you just have to work at it.
We think of games, the creation process of a game, as not ending when the first pass is done. So I think a common thing you'll find from a number of the best developers, I mean, that's when the iteration begins. I mean, once you finish your first cut at a video game, probably about half the stuff didn't work the way you expected or wasn't implemented in the way it could have been or is not even possible. So there's this whole phase of iterating and making it better.
There's kind of this myth about Blizzard that we just get an extra 6 months to a year and that's when we do all of our polish. But the reality is that we do our polish from the very beginning. Like even in the design meetings, we'll talk through ideas and be like, is that really going to be fun? How is that going to be played? What we try to do oftentimes is when we come up with the idea that we're going to put into the game, we build it for iteration. So we tell like the programmers or the artists right from the beginning, it's like, okay, don't put too much time into this art yet, just go this far so that way we can change things around.
The game approach to game design is all about making the player choices, trying to make with new choices, new experiences, making sure that the player has its mental engagement so that when he approaches a challenge, he gets stimuli.
My historic approach to game design has been building long experiences. My new approach, my learned approach to game design is figuring out how to design the right type of tool sets for people to create their own experiences. So it's a radically different shift in my own thinking. But I believe it's a critical shift to the future.
Ah yes, the future. Not to be rude, but in a world where user-created mods and even games are the norm, is there really one for professional game designers?
People still want polished games, but they're starting to put more and more weight on how original they are, how innovative, and whether or not they speak to them directly. And so you see this sort of interesting parallel between all mediums, sort of converging in a way that it's becoming less and less about professionals and more about getting unique and interesting messages out there.
The line between who is a producer versus who is a consumer has really been a kind of fuzzy, blurry line for a long, long time.
I am not worried about the impact of putting tools for user-generated content into the hands of the public. The more hands that you can put tools in, the more likely it is that some person out there is going to come up with the next Tetris or something like that.
We could care less about resumes. We are not looking for resumes anymore. We don't want to see any resumes. We're also not looking for people, well, I've been in the industry 18 years or whatever, and I can edit a level. What we want is the people that can just win hearts and minds. In the future, talent is going to be based on what they show up with. It's not going to be a case of, well, there's these 4 resumes and we'll just pick this guy. They're going to be pulled out of 20,000 people. That's the way I recruit these days.
Because this technology is so widespread now and available, will we see, does a professional have a place? Yes. It's like video cameras now. I can go down to Best Buy and pick one up for $500, right? It's a really good camera. Does that mean that Steven Spielberg's out of a job? If the kid in Utah, say, gets the iPhone and puts together a fun little app and then wants to compete on the next level, he's got to put in those years, 10 years, 20 years, to reach that high point, to produce stuff that's really amazing. And by that time, he's no longer a kid in a garage, he's now a professional.
Good luck with a career change. We'll see you next week on Players Only.